Now God be praised, I will die in peace. These were the final words of James Wolfe, the commander of the British forces who had just defeated the French at the gates of Quebec in Canada. Despite the pain, the general must also have felt a sense of relief. This battle marked the successful conclusion of a frustratingly prolonged siege. Wolfe must also have been well aware that the significance of this victory had secured him an honorable place in the annals of British military history. After the news of this great victory reached the shores of his homeland, the late general indeed soon enough became known as the hero of Quebec, the conqueror of Quebec, or even more grandly, the conqueror of Canada. The latter title was certainly no exaggeration. Quebec was the most important stronghold of French North America, and its capture was almost tantamount to the conquest of all of Canada. This video will highlight the decisive battle which determined the fates of Canada. Welcome to this week's episode of Heart of Oak. By 1759, the 7 Years' War had already been raging for 3 years on the European continent. Once again, the British and the French found themselves pitted against each other, each belonging to a strong alliance of various nations. However, the conflict between the French and the British can to some extent be considered a separate struggle. For them, entirely different issues were at stake compared to the other European kingdoms. The French and British were primarily fighting for control over overseas colonies in North America and India. From the 13 colonies, the armies of the British Crown advanced against the forces of France in what is now Canada. In 1759, one column conducted a successful campaign against the enemy forts along the present-day US-Canadian border. At the same time, British soldiers under Major General Geoffrey Amherst, in cooperation with the Royal Navy, managed to capture the northeastern fortress of Louisbourg from the sea. This fort, located at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, controlled access to Quebec and Montreal, the key cities of New France. The capture of this stronghold marked a major turning point in the struggle for Canada. The path to Quebec was now open. However, before advancing further, the British had to endure the harsh Canadian winter, during which the St. Lawrence River was almost entirely frozen. The British, however, did not remain idle during the winter months. A large expeditionary force was readied in Louisbourg for the decisive battle for Quebec. There was no need to bring in fresh troops from Europe, as there were sufficient numbers already available in North America. In total, around 7,700 soldiers were set to take part in the expedition. Command of the army was given to Major General James Wolfe, partly due to his distinguished role in the capture of Louisbourg. His experience with amphibious operations would prove valuable, as it was decided to attack Quebec via the St. Lawrence River. A massive fleet was needed for the transport and protection of so many soldiers. The British could not afford to be frugal with their warships for such an important undertaking. In total, the Royal Navy made 22 ships of the line available for the operation. Admiral Charles Saunders was appointed to lead this squadron. During the winter of 1758-1759, while the British Army and Navy were preparing in Louisbourg, Admiral Philip Durell was ordered to explore the St. Lawrence River as far as Île-aux-Coudres. This Canadian river was not only vast but also treacherous due to numerous shallows all the way to Quebec. Therefore, finding a safe passage before setting sail was of the utmost importance. The British had already experienced the dangers of navigating the St. Lawrence in a tragic manner. In 1711, an expedition to Quebec had ended in disaster with the loss of 8 ships and 850 men due to shipwreck. When Saunders arrived in Louisbourg at the end of April, he was dismayed to find that Durell had not yet set out. The commander of the British fleet was not pleased, and Durell immediately set sail for the river. In an attempt to make up for the delay, Durell sailed further than ordered, managing to reach Île d'Orléans. In other words, the British had made it safely to the doorstep of Quebec. This navigational success was thanks to the cooperation with local pilots and the expertise of the later world-famous navigator and explorer James Cook. Durell had placed buoys in his wake to mark the navigable route. Meanwhile, the invasion fleet and the expeditionary force were at full strength in Louisbourg. All the pieces of the puzzle were set. The expedition could begin. On the 1st of June, Saunders and Wolfe set sail with HMS Neptune at the head of the British expeditionary force bound for Quebec. Durell's reconnaissance squadron had done excellent work, and the ships arrived safely at Île d'Orléans on the 27th of June. When this news reached the French commander in Quebec, he must have been shocked. General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm was convinced that such a large fleet would never dare to approach Quebec. The French hurriedly manned the defenses and rolled out the cannons, preparing for a siege. The British first made camp opposite Quebec on Île d'Orléans. Shortly after their arrival, the besieged French were the first to strike. On the night of the 28th of June, the St. Lawrence River was ablaze. The French had launched a fireship attack at Saunders' fleet. However, the attempt was a complete failure as a nervous captain ignited his boat too early, giving the British ample warning and allowing them to maneuver out of harm's way. This event, though a failure, became the subject of one of the finest works by the renowned maritime painter Samuel Scott. This failed attack, along with the strong winds of the first few nights, demonstrated the vulnerability of the British fleet's current position. Saunders sought a more sheltered anchorage, choosing Point Levis on the right bank. Here, British soldiers set up a battery opposite Quebec's lower town, which they bombarded relentlessly, eventually reducing it to ruins. Meanwhile, Wolfe searched for a suitable landing site for an attack against the French. He selected Montmorency Falls, a waterfall northeast of Quebec near the suburb of Beauport. However, Montcalm had fortified this area well, and the British landing on the 31st of July was a disaster. Wolfe deployed his elite Louisbourg grenadiers, but their assault on the French defenses ended in heavy losses, forcing them eventually to retreat. After this setback, some French officers believed that the end of the British expedition was near. However, Wolfe and his troops were not so easily discouraged. The British resumed their tireless search for a suitable landing site on the left bank of the river. The British command had considered the possibility of an upstream operation early on. On the 18th of July, Captain Rouse managed to slip past the French batteries with several ships and establish a beachhead on the St. Lawrence southwest of Quebec. Initially, Wolfe had his doubts about an attack west of the city, fearing that his army would quickly be isolated and surrounded there. However, after the defeat of the 31st of July, the siege spread through the ranks and morale deteriorated day by day. Doubts about Wolfe's leadership began to surface, and he needed to act swiftly. By the end of August, the British commander had made up his mind and decided to force a breakthrough upstream. The element of surprise was entirely in his favor. Montcalm did not expect Wolfe to risk advancing along the route between Montreal and Quebec. The possibility of such an operation must have seemed like madness to Montcalm, especially as he had stationed a significant force under Louis de Bougainville near Cap Rouge in that area. Montcalm believed that the British west of Quebec could be surrounded in no time. The French commander was therefore convinced that Wolfe would once again attempt an attack near Montmorency Falls. Saunders took advantage of these enemy expectations by organizing a feint near Beauport, while Wolfe and his troops moved further upstream. The actual landing zone chosen by the British was Anse-au-Foulon, a 53-meter high cliff guarded by only 100 defenders. Beyond this cliff lay the Plains of Abraham, named after a 17th century pilot and fisherman who had been granted this land by the local authorities. This open ground was ideal for assembling an army. D-Day was set for the 13th of September. During the early hours of the 13th of September, under the cover of darkness, around 24 soldiers rode silently towards Anse-au-Foulon. Colonel William Howe had been selected to lead this group. His task was to take the local band of defenders by surprise and clear the way for Wolfe's troops. He nearly got caught during the ascent, as the soldiers were discovered by a French sentry. One of Howe's men, however, convinced the enemy in flawless French that they were a friendly supply unit. Howe and his men were soon able to drive off the guards at Anse-au-Foulon. This 30-year-old colonel's excellent execution of the mission earned him recognition, and he would go on to have a distinguished military career, eventually becoming the commander of the British forces during the early stages of the American War of Independence some 20 years later. Meanwhile, further east, Saunders successfully distracted the French with his feint. The admiral had placed sick British soldiers and sailors in rowboats to give the impression that a landing near Beauport was imminent. By now, the Plains of Abraham were filling with British soldiers who were preparing for the inevitable French response. By 8 a.m., around 4,500 British soldiers had landed. When Montcalm was informed of the enemy presence behind him, he wasted no time in marching to the Plains of Abraham. He decided not to wait for reinforcements and confronted Wolfe with about 3,500 men. The Plains of Abraham soon saw the two armies facing each other, with Wolfe's men forming a disciplined two-deep line in a horseshoe formation. When the French arrived, everything happened quickly. They fired the first volley, but it was disorganized and had little effect. The French army, unlike its opponent, was made up mostly of militia accustomed to guerrilla warfare in the forests around Quebec. They had little experience with open field battles. After the French had opened fire, Wolfe's redcoats advanced within 27 meters of the enemy. Then they unleashed a devastating volley, advancing and firing again shortly afterwards, followed by a bayonet charge. The orderly British fire was too much for the French, who broke and fled. The British were victorious, but at a high cost. Wolfe had been hit by 3 musket balls during the battle, the last of which pierced his chest. This wound proved to be fatal. After learning of the French retreat, Wolfe gave a few final orders and with his last breath said, "Now God be praised, I will die in peace." He then closed his eyes for the final time. Meanwhile, Bougainville's reinforcements arrived on the battlefield. However, upon hearing of Montcalm's defeat and retreat to Quebec, Bougainville decided to withdraw. The French also mourned the loss of their commander. Montcalm was mortally wounded during the battle and died the following morning. Meanwhile, British Brigadier General George Townshend took command and positioned his troops outside Quebec's walls. The new French commander, Governor Marquis de Vaudreuil-Cavagnal, deemed the position untenable and decided to evacuate Quebec with the bulk of his troops to join Bougainville's forces to the west. The city itself soon surrendered, with the French commander de Ramezay striking his colors on the 18th of September. The following year, the French forces of Montreal launched an attempt to retake Quebec. They came close after defeating the British at Sainte-Foy on the 28th of April, but a lack of artillery and ammunition led to the failure of the subsequent siege. Quebec would never fall again into French hands. After the Royal Navy destroyed Louis XV's fleet at the battles of Lagos and Quiberon Bay, the fate of Canada was sealed forever.